Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Have you ever felt something like this? Stay with me until the end and share your thoughts. The air in the Gold Coast room was thick with the scent of expensive truffle oil and even more expensive arrogance. It was a space designed for power, with hushed conversations and the soft, almost reverent clinking of silver on china against the backdrop of Chicago's glittering night skyline. Amidst the low hum of privilege, a sound cut through, sharp and jarring. Mark Holland's voice. The 50-year-old CEO, a man who built his empire on aggressive acquisitions and the myth of his own infallibility, was leaning over the white linen, his face a mask of scarlet fury. His target was Lena Reid, a waitress who looked impossibly small beneath the towering ceiling, her crisp apron doing little to hide the exhaustion etched around her eyes. He wasn't yelling in English, however. The words, clipped and hard, were being spat out in perfect, venomous Mandarin, an alien tongue designed to intimidate and humiliate an assumed outsider. Lena stood motionless, the serving tray held steady in hands that felt suddenly, terribly cold. Holland's tirade wasn't about the spilled water. There wasn't any. It was about his perception of her entire class. His prominent polished fingernail tapped furiously on the contract resting beside his untouched steak. The narrative the room projected was clear. A powerful man schooling an incompetent servant. She could feel the stares of his two high-profile clients, a pair of cold, polished men from Shanghai, watching with detached curiosity. The CEO, emboldened by the knowledge that his insult would remain a secret between him and his audience, repeated the phrase, his voice a low, cruel hiss in the foreign tongue. "A méi-yǒu-yong piece of trash," the Mandarin word for useless. It was a personal attack, a casual assassination of her dignity, and it was meant to be entirely invisible to her. The humiliation was a physical thing, a burning sensation that traveled from her ears down to her fingertips, threatening the stability of the tray. Lena was used to being ignored, to being treated as an extension of the silverware, but to be mocked with such open, sophisticated cruelty, to be judged and condemned in a language the perpetrator believed was a shield against consequence, was a new, deeper wound. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the stale, expensive air catching in her throat, reminding her of the reality. She needed this job. She needed the tips. And she needed the medical insurance far more than she needed to defend her pride against a powerful, petulant man. The sound of her own heart pounding was a frantic, desperate drumbeat against the overwhelming quiet of the high-stakes dinner. She met his eyes for a split second, and in that fleeting moment, the CEO saw not a blank, compliant face, but a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Cold, contained, intelligence. He dismissed it instantly, a trick of the light. He finished his angry monologue in Mandarin with a dismissive wave of his hand, signaling her to clear the bread plates. The movement was a silent command to disappear, to return to her place in the shadows of the service industry. Yet Lena did not move immediately to clear the plates. Instead, her posture straightened, and the movement was imperceptible, but the change in the atmosphere was not. She held his gaze for one beat, longer than was professionally acceptable, a tiny, defiant rebellion that felt seismic in the rarefied atmosphere of the restaurant. The encounter, this casual act of cruelty, was far more than a typical Tuesday night insult. It was a devastating echo of Lena's private struggle. She was not a stranger to disdain, but this specific table, this particular CEO, represented the inaccessible world she was desperately trying to breach. Holland's tailored Italian suit and the effortless, entitled way he leaned back in his leather chair were in stark contrast to the worn-out textbook on international trade law currently tucked inside. Lena's locker, its spine cracked from relentless late-night study sessions. The silence in the wake of his Mandarin outburst was heavy, broken only by the clink, clink, clink of a client idly stirring his tea, a subtle metronome marking her enduring discomfort and the agonizingly slow passage of time. It was in this suffocating silence that the second, far more unsettling figure arrived, a small, silent entity that was the very foundation of Lena's exhaustion. A small photograph, slightly faded, at the edges, had somehow slipped from the breast pocket of her apron while she was bracing herself, landing face up near the CEO's elbow. The picture was of her daughter, 5-year-old Elara, a wide-eyed, fragile girl with a thin, almost translucent smile. This wasn't an item she kept carelessly. It was her shield, her reason, and its sudden appearance in the spotlight felt like a violation. Holland, who had been about to resume his high-stakes conversation in Mandarin, paused, his eyes falling. On the image, his expression shifted, not into pity, he was incapable of that, but into a flash of calculating contempt. He used the tip of his finger to push the photo away, toward the very edge of the table, as if it were a speck of dirt. "Your distraction, miss," he stated in perfect clipped English this time, his voice devoid of any warmth, "is quite clear. Pity, but this room demands focus." It wasn't the words that stung, but the implied profound judgment of her being a working mother, a creature distracted by messy human needs, unfit for the efficient machinery of his world. One of the Chinese clients, however, a man with wise, surprisingly empathetic eyes named Mr. Chen, picked up the photograph with a gentleness that betrayed his powerful stature. He looked at Elara's thin, delicate face, then back to Lena, whose own face was now drawn taut with the fear of being fired. Mr. Chen said nothing, but his direct, prolonged gaze at Lena was a question, an invitation to a shared moment of human recognition that completely disregarded the CEO's tyrannical presence. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement of her humanity and her burden, a sudden, unexpected alliance that felt like a lifeline thrown across a chasm. Lena managed a nearly imperceptible nod to Mr. Chen, a micro-gesture of thanks that she knew the CEO would miss. That silent exchange was the rupture in her professional facade. The mask of the impassive server cracked just enough to reveal the bone-deep weariness underneath. Holland, oblivious to the subtle shift in power dynamics, merely cleared his throat loudly, demanding the attention back. He reached for a water glass, the gesture impatient, and the action was a renewed order for Lena to remember her place, to be silent and to serve. It was that simple, dismissive hand gesture coupled with the silent, knowing gaze of Mr. Chen that destabilized Lena completely. The CEO's hand hovered over the glass, the fine gold ring on his finger, catching the light. Lena, however, didn't pour the water. She simply stood her ground for a second too long, her gaze now fixed not on the CEO, but on the glass, as if calculating its weight. The air held its breath, waiting for her to either shatter or comply. The subtle tension emanating from Lena was not lost on the CEO, yet he misinterpreted it entirely, viewing her hesitation as the expected subservience of a defeated low-wage worker. He saw compliance where there was only a fierce internal debate. Get the tip, get the insurance. Ignore the noise. This mantra, honed by years of balancing multiple shifts and the terrifying uncertainty of Elara's medical expenses, was her only defense. She had to be a ghost, a robot, entirely devoid of the emotional complexity that could jeopardize her means of survival. The high-end restaurant, with its polished marble and dimmed, flattering lights, felt suddenly like a gilded cage where the price of entry was her silence. But the silence was now an illusion. Holland, turning back to his clients, decided to use the foreign language to openly disparage her further, this time with a clear, specific reference to the discarded photograph. In fluent Mandarin, he commented with a sneer, "These distractions, Mr. Chen, are the reason for their méi-yǒu-yong lives, a constant heavy weight." The words were an unexpected, direct attack on Elara's existence, and the phrase heavy weight landed with the force of a physical blow, crashing through her fragile emotional barrier. The sound of his voice speaking that particular language was a sudden, violent catalyst for memory. It wasn't just Mandarin, it was the language of her late father, a brilliant, eccentric professor of international relations who had insisted on immersing his daughter in the complexities of the world, convinced she was destined for a diplomatic career, not a dining room floor. Lena could hear his voice now, not the CEO's sneer, but her father's gentle, insistent tone. "Lena, remember, language is power. Never let them assume your silence means ignorance." The remembered words were a ghost of dignity, momentarily stronger than the CEO's present malice. A faint, almost undetectable scent, the faint cologne worn by Mr. Chen, perhaps triggered a deeper, more painful recollection. It was the same sandalwood aroma her father had worn on the day she received her acceptance letter to Georgetown Law School, an acceptance she had to defer, then abandon, when her father's sudden illness coincided with Elara's complex birth diagnosis. That simple, familiar scent was a sharp reminder of the future she had been forced to trade for survival, the ambitious path swapped for the anonymous certainty of an hourly wage. Lena's resistance stiffened. She gripped the edge of the serving cart, her knuckles white. The CEO, now immersed in a detailed, whispered discussion of a high-stakes, cross-border merger, assumed she had retreated. But the old textbook in her locker, her constant, forbidden companion, was now screaming its silent protest in her mind. It wasn't just a book. It was a promise made to the ghost of her father and a vow to her daughter. She had promised Elara that this temporary life was not her permanent destiny. She watched Holland's lips move, the arrogance in his eyes absolute. He believed he had won the small battle of attrition, that her spirit was crushed. She was ready to rationalize, to retreat again, telling herself it was just a job, just a temporary humiliation. But the image of Elara's fragile smile on the photo, coupled with the echoing phrase from her father, "Never let them assume your silence means ignorance," ignited a slow, controlled burn of indignation. She began to pour the water, her hands steady now, robotically professional. Yet, as the ice-cold water rushed into the glass, her focus was not on the rim, but on the flow of the CEO's whispered Mandarin. She wasn't just listening to the insults. She was analyzing the syntax, the cadence, the meaning. The resistance had failed. She was no longer trying to retreat. She was leaning in, waiting for a vulnerability in his high-walled fortress of entitlement. The CEO's next words, still in Mandarin, were spoken with a careless flourish, a testament to his assumption of privacy and the low IQ of his audience. He gestured toward a complicated table in the contract, dismissively. That table, Lena suddenly realized, involved the legal definition of asset depreciation under the new Shanghai Agreement, a complex term she had studied only last night, not as a waitress, but as an aspiring international legal scholar. The air crackled with a possibility that was terrifying and liberating all at once. The CEO, Mark Holland, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift occurring in the quiet young woman beside him, continued his discussion, the Mandarin flowing easily, confidently, and carelessly. He pointed to a clause on page 7 of the thick legal document. And as for the jià-zhí, he declared, using the term for market value, it must be calculated according to the old Q2 structure. If they disagree, we simply cite clause 4.3, asserting its jibenji, its intrinsic value, is non-negotiable. He delivered this with a decisive thump of his finger on the mahogany table, clearly expecting no challenge from anyone in the room, especially not the quiet server refilling his glass. His clients nodded in agreement, accepting his interpretation as fact, a truth dictated by his position. Lena's mind was now racing, the roar of blood in her ears drowning out the clinking cutlery. She had studied that exact section extensively. Clause 4.3, concerning asset depreciation in the new bilateral treaty, had been the focus of her all-night cram session. She knew with chilling certainty that the CEO had made a fundamental error, not just a linguistic slip, but a critical misinterpretation of a legal term that could cost his company millions. The new regulation explicitly superseded the Q2 structure, requiring calculation based on gongping jià-zhí, or fair value, a distinctly different and higher figure that would severely impact his profits and potentially jeopardize the deal. For a terrifying, agonizing 60 seconds, Lena fought the urge to speak. Her professional training screamed at her to remain silent. Her financial reality demanded submission. But the echo of the CEO's cruel public judgment, méi-yǒu-yong, piece of trash, combined with the immense silent sacrifice of her knights, finally shattered the dam. She saw not just a rude man, but a powerful fool, whose reckless ignorance was built on the cheap assumption of her inferiority. Her hand, which had been perfectly steady pouring the water, visibly trembled for a brief moment, causing the water to nearly overflow, a tiny, visual cliffhanger that drew the eyes of Mr. Chen. Mr. Chen watched her closely, his earlier empathy now overlaid with a profound, quiet curiosity. He recognized the look of a person holding back an absolute truth. Sensing a shift in the atmosphere, Holland looked up impatiently, catching sight of Lena's unwavering, intense gaze fixed directly on the contract. He sneered, misinterpreting her scrutiny. "Is the contract too complex for your understanding, miss?" he asked in English, deliberately condescending, hoping to force her retreat. "Perhaps you should focus on the service." That was the spark. Lena took a single deep breath. The scent of polished leather and old money filled her lungs. She set the water pitcher down with a controlled, quiet precision that commanded attention. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but astonishingly clear, cutting through the thick Chicago air like a finely sharpened blade. It was delivered in flawless, educated Mandarin. "Excuse me, Mr. Holland," she began, the words resonating with a perfect Beijing-accented authority. "With respect to Clause 4.3, she continued, her eyes never leaving his, a silent challenge in her gaze. "The term you cited, jià-zhí, or intrinsic value, was retired in the Q4 revision of the treaty, the correct and legally enforceable term for asset calculation in the current agreement. Is gongping jià-zhí, or fair value. Under the new structure, that adjustment alone shifts the liability by nearly $18 million. The final words were delivered with the calm confidence of a barrister concluding a closing argument. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A profound, humiliating silence descended upon the table. Holland's face, already flushed with wine and anger, drained entirely of color, leaving a sickly white beneath his tan. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Mr. Chen and his colleague, on the other hand, exchanged a rapid, astonished glance, their expressions transitioning from detached interest to sudden, intense respect. They clearly recognized the terminology and the gravity of the legal error Holland had been about to commit. Lena had just weaponized her forgotten potential, her humiliation transformed into undeniable authority. She wasn't just fluent, she had exposed his profound, expensive ignorance. To offer proof, she reached into the small zipped compartment of her apron, pulling out not a pen but a small folded printout, a photocopy of the specific treaty clause in Mandarin, heavily underlined, a direct visual consequence of her night spent studying. She placed it gently beside Holland's glass, a silent but devastating piece of evidence. The two Shanghai clients immediately pushed their chairs back from the table. Mr. Chen leaned in, his eyes locked on the printout, utterly ignoring the stunned CEO. He picked up the paper confirming the highlighted text. His low, respectful voice, also in Mandarin, was directed entirely at Lena. "Miss, your knowledge is Shen Qi, extraordinary." He looked at Holland, then back at Lena, a clear, unmistakable judgment rendered in his eyes. Holland, now scrambling for his own contract copy, was reduced to a frantic, stuttering fool. Lena felt a sudden, dizzying lightness. The fear of being fired was still there, but it was overshadowed by a searing, triumphant clarity. She had honored her father's memory, not by succeeding in a past life, but by defending her present dignity. Mr. Chen's colleague, now standing, pulled a business card from his pocket, scrawling a personal number on the back. He placed the card, not on the table, but directly into Lena's trembling hand, a gesture of immediate non-verbal recruitment, a visual cliffhanger proving the tide had irrevocably turned. Mark Holland, the once indomitable CEO, was now a portrait of silent, self-inflicted devastation. The sound of Mr. Chen and his colleague, now speaking urgently in rapid Mandarin, was a powerful, symbolic stripping of his authority. He tried to regain control, stammering an incoherent mix of English and broken Mandarin, attempting to dismiss Lena's correction as a minor technicality. But the damage was total. He had been publicly, decisively outsmarted, not by a rival CEO, but by the person he had just declared useless. The weight of his own arrogance had finally crushed him. Mr. Chen turned his back entirely on Holland, facing Lena with profound seriousness. He spoke with the quiet dignity of someone recognizing a true professional, completely ignoring Holland's existence. "Miss Reid," he stated in perfect English, his tone devoid of surprise, "it is clear your knowledge surpasses the table you serve. This transaction is cancelled. We do not do business with people whose foundational understanding is so severely flawed, particularly when it is corrected by such quiet competence." The finality in his voice was absolute, and with a slight respectful bow to Lena, he and his colleague walked silently toward the exit, their footsteps echoing the demise of Holland's million-dollar deal. Lena watched them go, her breath catching in her throat. The immediate fear of being fired had been replaced by a powerful, disorienting surge of vindication and release. She looked. Down at the business card in her hand, the embossed paper a physical symbol of a future she thought was lost forever. It was a card from a powerful international law firm, and the handwritten note on the back simply read, "Call me tomorrow. We need someone who speaks truth to power." The silence was deafening. Holland was left alone at the expansive, opulent table, the remnants of his untouched meal and his failed deal spread before him. Lena was still standing, holding the now empty water pitcher. She didn't gloat. She didn't even look at him. She was focused inward, on the sudden, terrifying realization that she had just chosen dignity over safety, and the universe had unexpectedly rewarded her courage. Finally, she placed the water pitcher back on the service cart. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely centered. She raised her eyes, not to the CEO's face, but to the skyline visible through the immense glass window, a vast, glittering expanse of opportunity that suddenly seemed reachable. The entire scene was one of intense, intimate stillness, the final silent standoff between a man who had lost everything but his money and a woman who had just gained everything but her money. In a voice that was barely a whisper, a tone devoid of malice and filled only with a profound, quiet strength, Lena addressed the empty space around the CEO, not him directly. She spoke only a single sentence in English, a final, unanswerable statement that transcended their power dynamic. "Everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about, Mr. Holland. Never assume ignorance." Then she simply turned her back and walked toward the staff exit, the worn textbook waiting in her locker, feeling suddenly lighter than air. The last image is not of the elegant dining room, nor the humiliated CEO, but of a cramped, dimly lit apartment kitchen several hours later. The sounds of the city are muffled, replaced by the soft, steady breathing of Elara sleeping peacefully in the next room. Lena sits at a small, chipped table, the harsh fluorescent light illuminating the weary relief on her face. In one hand, she holds the business card from Mr. Chen's firm, its high-quality paper feeling alien and promising. In the other, she holds the worn, spine-cracked international law textbook, the pages open to the section on Gongping jià-zhí, fair value. She carefully folds the expensive business card and tucks it deep into the center of the textbook, marking her place not with a bookmark, but with a vow of change. She traces the embossed writing on the card, a silent acknowledgement that the chaotic, impossible balance of the last 5 years had finally tipped, not into failure, but into freedom. The textbook, once a heavy symbol of deferred dreams and silent sacrifice, was now a vessel of tangible opportunity, its weight transformed into the lightness of hope. She slowly rises and walks to her daughter's bedside. Elara is still, her small form almost lost beneath the blanket. Lena leans down not to wake her, but to whisper a promise into the silent, shared space of their future. "We don't just survive anymore, my love," she murmurs, her voice thick with unshed tears of relief. "We move forward, with dignity." It is a final act of catharsis, a deep, cleansing breath of a woman who has reclaimed her narrative. Lena turns off the kitchen light, leaving only the soft glow of the moon reflecting off the spine of the law textbook. The business card, now nestled within the book's pages, is the final powerful image, the collision of her arduous past with her deserved future. The silence is not one of exhaustion, but of quiet, powerful anticipation. The waitress apron is off, and the scholar has finally stood up. If this story of quiet dignity moved you, don't forget to like and share it with someone who needs hope, and a reminder that true strength isn't always loud. Who's the one person you'd never give up on, the one you fight for every single day? Tell us in the comments.